For a very long time, for a couple of million years at least, if not more, people walked around the countryside in small groups. They hunted, they harvested things that they found in nature, and they sort of fed themselves and maintained themselves doing that. And then, about 25,000 years ago, some changes kicked in. And probably because people had evolved a better cognitive apparatus and better sense of technology, they began to diversify. And that led around 10,000 BP, that is about 10,000 years ago, to the first villages. Villages where people gathered together. So the real question here for villages, but also for cities, is why do people gather together? And many theories have been sort of offered that argue that this is all to save energy. That is, by living together, you just spend much less energy and so on and so forth. Now, according to the more recent research that we have done, that actually is not really a valid argument. And you can imagine that very easily, because the bigger the group, the further you have to go to actually feed the group. So if energy is not the real reason why cities emerged, we need to look for another one. And that is where I'd like to put with you a bit of a different perspective on urban evolution altogether. Societies, humans, societies, process matter, things, energy, work, but also information. Now the interesting thing is that energy and matter cannot be shared. I can throw you a piece of chalk like I do in my classroom, and then you have it, but I don't have it anymore. The interesting thing is that information isn't like that. That can actually be shared. I can tell you something, you can retain it, and I still keep it. So our idea is that cities and villages actually emerge as a tool to help process information. And I think you could imagine that cycle a little bit like this. People are confronted with some challenges, some problems. They solve them. But of course, any solution comes up with new problems, unintended problems, intended problems, things that emerge out of that difficulty. And so you have to do the next solution, and the next set of problems, and the next solution. And so in that process, what we argue is that people needed to depend more and more on communication, less and less on being individuals, and more on actually forming a group. And that bringing people physically together in villages and later in towns is actually the mechanism that drives urban evolution. Now, more recently, work that we have done together with people at the Santa Fe Institute and in Italy has come to the conclusion, by analyzing modern cities and doing what you would call allometric scaling, which is trying to compare quantities about cities through their size range, we come to the conclusion that actually as cities grow, they use less and less energy per capita. They use more and more information per capita. And so the idea here is that it is that information processing that allows cities and drives cities to grow bigger and bigger. So in what follows this lesson and following lessons, I will try and take some aspects of that and explain to you how all of this works. Imagine you have a community, and you have a community of a few thousand people. Those people need to be fed. So energy and matter need to come in from the outside of the city. And as the city grows, they need to come in from a wider and wider area. How do you manage that? Well, you've got to organize the countryside around your city. You've got to burn down the forest, take out the stumps, make fields, cultivate cereals, have herds, start trading, and so on and so forth, to get those things into the city to make people survive in that city. But that organizing the countryside, organizing the area around it, is in itself an information processing activity. So what you effectively see is that cities and later larger entities are effectively flow structures in the sense that energy flows in, drawn in by the people living in the city, but in order to keep doing that and keep expanding, they need to process more and more information. And that leads them to start innovating. And so innovation is an absolutely crucial characteristic of cities. If a city doesn't innovate anymore, it loses against other cities, it loses its contact with the surrounding world, and little by little it actually sort of disappears, or at least people start disappearing from it because it's more advantageous to them to go somewhere else. Now that is a dynamic that happened 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, and that actually happened until very, very recently. However, that dynamic happened slowly, and the growth of cities was a slow one. It led ultimately to empires like the Roman Empire, when the city became so big that you couldn't feed people anymore, even in the surroundings, and you start getting things from very far away, trade objects, to actually help the city survive. But around 1800 AD, a very fundamental change happened. Then, suddenly, we started using fossil energy. Up to that moment, let's say for the last 10,000 years until about 1800, the evolution of cities had been limited by the limitations of energy. We only had human energy, animal energy, wind energy, solar energy to make our crops grow, but we didn't have anything else. With the introduction of the steam engine and the use of fossil fuel, suddenly energy became cheap. And that meant that people could develop many new things, many new technologies, and that is what led to the last 2 centuries of our development. And that changes the perspective on sustainability. Most people in politics, but also in civil society, argue that we now need to innovate our way out of the sustainability problems that we're having. But we forget in saying that effectively we innovated our way into the problem in the first place by having 2 centuries in which we, with very cheap energy, could innovate anything we wanted and didn't keep any control over what we were innovating. And in particular, the last 60 years have seen this proliferation of the consumer society, which is basically based on innovating more and more gadgets that are sort of useful to some extent. They're pleasant, but they're not really necessary. Well, that is the point where I now want to take off in the next lesson and try and tell you a little bit about the consequences of that.